Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 2 game from the Charlotte Summer GMIM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I had a draw with the white pieces against FM Gauri Shankar, and I was hoping to play a little bit better in this one because I didn't really get the concrete winning chances that I wanted to get with the white pieces. So in this one I was black, and I was actually playing another strong opponent because this is a closed group, so it means that every player is pretty much close to 2400 or higher level, all GMs and IMs for the most part. And in this one I was playing none other than International Master Andrew Hong. Now, if you followed this series, you know that I've played I am Andrew Hong a few times already this year, and he's another one of these guys that's, very active on the American chess circuit and a very talented player in his own right. I think I mentioned this before, but when I first met him, I actually thought he was a little bit older than he was, and it was to my shock and awe when I discovered that this 6-foot-tall kid was only like 14 or 15 years old. So yeah, it just makes me feel kind of old out there, but it is what it is. There's talent everywhere, and particularly among the young players now. So yeah. So in any case, I was black and Andrew is white, and well, let's get into it. Full disclosure, though, actually, before going over this game, this is actually the longest game I've played so far this year. So it was a marathon affair, and I'm going to prepare you now. So, yeah, we'll see if I actually analyze every single move of the game as I normally do, or if, we might do some skimming and sum up certain sections. But, yeah, it is what it is. Anyways, so Andrew opened with e4. Not a huge surprise. He's an e4 player for the most part. And the question is what I was going to do to attack his e4. And I decided to play c6. The Caro-Kann had been serving me pretty decently in the last few games I played it. So I thought, what the hell? So after d4, d5, I wasn't completely sure what variation Andrew would go for, but he went for the advanced variation, e5. And these days, the advance is probably the most popular line against the Caro-Kann. The idea is just to seize space in the center, and it's actually really quite a positional line a lot of the time. Normally, in the absolute main line, black goes bishop f5, knight f3, e6, and bishop e2, and white is playing very positionally and relatively modestly, just trying to castle pretty quickly, and then perhaps attack black center later, or sometimes constrain black c5 break. So one of the main lines is knight d7, castles, knight e7, knight bd2, h6, and knight b3. And part of this knight d2, b3 maneuver is designed to constrain this c5 break, which normally black tries to free his game with. So anyways, normally I do, against the advanced variation, go for bishop f5, but today I thought, it was maybe a good idea to surprise my opponent because I had played the bishop f5 line exclusively, and you never want to be a one-trick pony because that makes it much easier for your opponents to prepare against you. And before this game, I actually had taken a look at the alternative in this position, which is c5, and I decided to play this one. And yeah, this must have come as a surprise to my opponent because I'd never played the c5 line before. And the idea in the structure is that after d takes e5 and e6, white's actually taken this pawn and is up a pawn temporarily, but black is actually willing to play the structure that's more of a French now instead of a Caro-Kann because the bishop is stuck behind the chain because white has released the tension in the center. And so the argument is that long term, this e5 pawn that has basically taken a lot of space on the king side now and is kind of a wedge in the position that gives white attacking chances in the short term may actually be a weakness in the long term. So that's pretty much the justification for playing this way. After e6, white played knight f3. This is actually the third most popular move, but typically things tend to transpose here. The main move that people are playing these days is actually a3, and you'll see how the knight f3 line transposes to a3 because it was played a few moves later. The other alternative in this position is actually bishop e3. And these lines are actually less popular these days because black has kind of shown reasonable ways to get counterplay on the c5 pawn by going knight d7 and trying to recover it right away. And white's attempt to kind of hold on to the pawn with bishop b5 is playable, but not necessarily best. I mean, I think black has many options here, like knight e7 and knight c6 to try and unpin the knight to try and attack this pawn again. And there's also queen c7, and so typically white doesn't actually get to hang on to the extra pawn after dc5. And if he does, black has really good counterplay, kind of attacking this pawn multiple times, and even sometimes playing a5 if white reinforces the pawn with b4. So all in all, bishop e3 is not really prominent these days. So anyway, after e6, knight f3, I went bishop takes c5 now, just picking up that pawn. No need to delay taking it if it's available. And now bishop d3 was played. A little bit of an unusual move order. Typically, a3 is played first. And the merit of playing a3 a little bit sooner is that you actually get in this b4 move sooner and you kick the bishop away and force it typically to the b6 square. One of the main questions in this position is that when white goes for b4, where the bishop should retreat. So it can retreat to either e7 or b6, and the pros and cons to both. On b6, you're on this really active diagonal, but you're not actually near the black king, protecting the king side where white already has space because of this wedge on e5. Whereas if you're on e7, the bishop is more of a defensive piece, and it takes away the e7 square from the knight on g8. So it makes it somewhat harder to develop, and sometimes black needs to go f6 or knight h6 to get that knight into the game. So pros and cons to both squares for the bishop, but just to give you an idea of where the bishop normally goes after b4. And a lot of the times the point is after b4 is the white bishop is put on b2 and then exerts pressure along this diagonal. And with the bishop coming to d3, you have two nice long bishops pointing at the king and making it difficult for black to kind of lash out with any pawn breaks. Anyways, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but you'll see some of these themes in a moment. So I went knight e7 now. And, oh, sorry, this is not the game. This is what could be played. Knight e7, b4, bishop b6, bishop d3, and a5. This type of thing can potentially be played. But instead, bishop d3 was played. And what that meant for me is that b4 is not yet an idea. And so I actually took the luxury to develop this knight to e7 really quickly. And then after castles, I was still a little bit surprised because you could see as long as b4 is not played very quickly, my bishop doesn't have to retreat to b6. So what I did was I played knight d7, and now a3 was played, entertaining the b4 break. And I thought for a little bit, and I thought maybe this bishop would actually better be served on e7. So I actually decided to play the move knight g6. And this is actually a very, very original idea. I checked the database, and the setup with knight g6 and bishop e7 had only been seen 4 times, or 3 times if you don't include this game. So very, very original idea. And to be honest, I came up with this setup at the board. So I'm quite proud of finding a very interesting theme in this position because, again, typically the bishop doesn't necessarily have the privilege of going to e7 if you don't want to play this f6 and knight h6 stuff. So I was not so keen on playing f6 to weaken my king side, so I actually was very pleased to actually bring my bishop to e7 and get my knight out to g6 unscathed. Now, one question you might ask is, why not just castle? You talk about connecting rooks and all this stuff. Isn't that something that's really important? Well, castling in this position is actually losing. And the reason is because a knight is not on f6, a lot of times this Greek gift sacrifice actually works. So if bishop takes h7 check here, king takes h7, knight g5, if the king comes back, queen h5 is already mate because queen h7 just comes and there's nothing you could do about it. Even if rook e8, queen 7, king f8, queen h8 check, knight g8, knight h7, this is not going to be pretty, right? You could see how this king is not finding shelter at all. So, in actual fact, it's actually just a mating attack if you castle right away. And so, very, very careful not to get Greek gifted in this line. I'm sure it's happened before. One argument you could make instead of castling and instead of playing knight g6 is maybe to play h6 to kind of enable yourself to castle freely without the bishop takes h7 idea. But one of the things that you have to be wary of with h6 is that you create a hook for white's pieces to attack. And, at some point, I would not be surprised if a g4, g5 happened, or if some sacrifice on h6 happened. I mean, these types of things are possible. And then when you play h6, the move f6 is kind of out of the question because you've weakened this diagonal too much, and in particular, the g6 square. So kind of reluctant to go for that type of plan. So anyways, I went knight g6. White now went b4, and now I put my bishop on e7. And my concept with bishop b7 will be revealed in just a moment because white played bishop b2, and now I decided to play the second phase of my plan, which was the move a5. And this was essentially my concept with the bishop on e7, was that after a5, I'm actually attacking the pawn on b4 multiple times, so you can't actually effectively keep the tension on b4. If the bishop was on b6, this b4 pawn would not be targeted multiple times, but here the pawn has to make a decision. And if you play c3 to reinforce the pawn again, you're actually blocking your bishop on this diagonal and just hanging the pawn on e5, so you can't really do that. And so you're pretty much obliged to either take the pawn on a5 or to push your pawn to b5. But in either situation, you give black the c5 square for his pieces. So this was essentially my idea, was that by playing a5, I secure the c5 square for my pieces and get a little bit more activity, even though, it seems like white has a little bit more space in the center and the king side. The other benefit to this is that in endgames, I thought that his pawns now being really far advanced could actually be targets. I already mentioned that this e5 pawn I'm hoping is a target later in the game. Well, maybe the b5 or a3, the b4 or a3 pawns could be targets if they're separated. So this was the other concept there. So I was very happy to find this. So after a5, white went for b5, pushing forward. And I actually went for the move a4. And this was actually, again, another extension of the ideas. I wanted to make sure the a3 and b5 pawns were split, because I figured as long as they were split and not connected, they would be potential targets later. So that was kind of my idea, and yeah, we'll see how it panned out. So white now went for c4, trying to break open the position, which is quite logical, actually. In many setups here, white actually wants to open the center because he's more space, and he actually has a lead in development. So it makes sense to try and open the center. And my pawn structure here was so solid, this pawn chain through h7 to d5, so it makes sense to get at this one. Last but not least, after the d5 pawn goes, the d6 square, which is extremely sensitive, may be a square that white can actually take advantage of with a knight coming in there. So that's actually the thing I have to really be wary about in this position, was the knight actually invading and getting pressure along the d and c files before I'm truly ready to deal with it. Now after c4, I have a decision. I actually can play either knight c5 or I could take on c4. I actually decided to take on c4, but just to show you what knight c5 looks like, after knight c5, c takes d5, queen takes d5, there are actually some very interesting lines because it appears that I'm going to secure the bishop pair. Note that a move like bishop e2 is just a little bit too passive, and after we trade queens, I actually get the position I was kind of hoping for. So, for instance, if I play knight b3 now, after queen takes d5, e takes d5, rook a2, you can see a scenario here where I'm quite active with the knight on b3. The pawn on b5 and a3 might be a little bit weak because they're split. And even the pawn on e5 might be a potential target. And I just have a lot of activity here. This knight could come to f4. This bishop can come to e6 and stabilize my structure. My rook could come to c8. And I think black is actually completely fine. So because of that, after knight c5, you're pretty much obliged to play bishop takes g6. And here I could just play h takes g6, and after queen takes d5, e takes d5. Again, I have the two bishops here, and white's pawns on the queen side aren't the strongest pawns, so I thought that I'd have really good counterplay. Even though my pawn on d5 is isolated, I'd reckon and go as far to say even if the pawn on d5 wasn't on the board, I believe the two bishops offer me really good compensation in this position, in particular because these pawns are not totally secure. So that was kind of one of the things that was a possibility. But instead, I actually decided to play d takes c4. And the reason for that is after bishop takes c4, I thought this bishop was really misplaced on this diagonal, biting on granite, if you will, on the e6 pawn. So anyways, after bishop takes c4, I castled finally. And white played queen e2. And this is actually sort of like the big theme in the structure. Again, the rook's trying to barrel down on d1 and potentially c1 and really get the activity in the middle before the e5 pawn becomes a weakness and before my queen side is fully developed. So now I have to act really quickly to try to, get play going before that becomes a problem. I decided to play knight b6, trying to develop my knight with tempo to the c4 square. Another option was actually to just play b6 and develop my bishop via b7 and then maybe put my bishop on c5 and queen on e7. And I could have had something like knight bd2, bishop b7, knight e4, and even rook c8. But one of the things I was really wary of in this structure was a position where my queen is still stuck on d8 and a rook is bearing down on d1 and the knight's headed for d6. And I just did not want to tolerate a circumstance like that. So I really thought that knight b6, at least slowed down white from getting in this knight to e4 plan, and that's why I did it. Because now I'm actually right away trying to secure the two bishops. So after knight b6, white actually went bishop a2, and I was actually really happy with this because I thought, again, this is the wrong diagonal for the bishop, kind of biting on granite again. I thought bishop d3 made a little bit more sense, just overprotecting the b5 pawn, and also eyeing the h7 pawn, which is the real sort of weakness in my position as far as my pawn structure is concerned. So I didn't really like the bishop going to this diagonal, although it's not the end of the world. I now decide to play bishop d7. Passive, I know, but at the end of the day, I'm trying to get closer to connecting my rooks, and b6 and bishop b7 is no longer a possibility with my knight on b6. So after bishop d7, white went knight c3, just developing, again, trying to get to d6, and I went for knight f4 now, because again, I wanted to distract white from this plan. Now, I could have actually gone rook c8, and the idea now is that in some lines, I'm actually trying to go bishop c5 or rook c5, and the computer suggests after rook c8, rook fd1 and rook c5, and gives me a quite satisfactory position because now the rook on c5 is eyeing the b5 pawn, so it's kind of holding up the knight for now from rushing into e4. But very, very complicated position. Instead, I like knight f4 because it was a little bit more concrete and forcing, and it asked the queen to move and make a tough decision. The queen went to e4, which it makes a lot of sense, actually hitting my knight on f4 and eyeing this diagonal. And my idea with knight f4 now was actually, again, to distract this knight from going to e4. So I was kind of happy that the queen was there instead of the knight. But the question was now, what do I do? The knight on f4 is attacked, and the pawn on b7 is attacked. And my concept here was to play knight fd5. And this move is a potential pawn, comes with a potential pawn sacrifice, but it was a circumstance in which I would secure the two bishops for it if he went for it, and I thought that was enough compensation. So if knight takes d5 is played, I'll of course recapture with the knight first, preserving my structure. And now if you really want to, dislodge this knight, that's a beautiful knight, you have to give up the bishop pair. And after bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and queen takes d5, I thought I had the very, very important move, bishop e6, which really consolidates my position. And even though I'm a pawn down here, the two bishops provide me ample compensation, and the bishop on e6 is doing a lovely job of restricting the bishop on this diagonal. I mean, this bishop would love to get in the game with an e6 break, but this bishop here is just cementing my king side, and I thought here I'd be absolutely fine. One thing to note is that queen takes b7 loses on the spot if you try to recover a second pawn because of bishop d5 trapping the queen. And note that there's nowhere the queen can go where it's secure. So, yeah, quite remarkable position. But again, just gives you an idea what the two bishops are capable of in an open position. And they certainly are, can provide compensation for a pawn. So Andrew Hong actually agreed with me and did not go try win the pawn, and instead actually tried to keep pieces on the board and went for the move bishop b1. And bishop b1 is extremely aggressive, right? Staking the intentions with queen takes h7 mate and really forcing my hand because I have to block this diagonal, and the only reasonable way to do that is g6. So I did that pretty hastily. But you can see now I have a little bit more, I've kind of stabilized in the middle, right? This knight didn't get to d6 like it intended to, and now these pawns on the queen side are potential targets. So I felt pretty good if I felt pretty good about my future chances in this game if I was going to sort of stave off the initiative on the king side. So the idea is if I place some good defensive moves, I think I'd hold up okay. So anyways, after g6, bishop d3 was played, and now I played knight takes c3, getting that knight off the board so that knight e4 doesn't come into the game. And after knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, I went knight d5, replacing my knight that just was exchanged on d5, and I thought I was in really good shape here. The bishop is hit, a3 is weak, b5 is weak. Doesn't seem like there's an attack coming, so I thought, okay, I'm doing all right here. After knight d5, bishop d2 back was played, and this is an interesting move, shifting gears towards the king side potentially. And now I went queen b6, and it's kind of a race in certain respects because I need to get my counterplay going on the c file before white, crashes through on the king side. So I have to sort of be hasty about how I handle this position. After queen b6, rook fb1 was played, and this move is not the most aggressive in my opinion. You could try a move like queen g4, trying to shift gears towards the king side and introduce h4, h5 ideas, and I would need a very, very precise reaction to deal with this because if h4, h5 comes, then there will be a sacrifice on g6, opening up my king side. So I'd actually have to go rook fc8, and after h4, I would need to play the very, very important h5. And the point is I stopped the h5 break for white, and I forced the queen backwards, and now after bishop e8, I very critically overprotect the g6 pawn from sacrifices on that square. So this would have required very, very precise defense, and I think I would have found this because I was already planning to play rook fc8, and it's quite clear that h5 is not something I should allow, so I think I would have found this, but at least it would have kind of forced my hand a little bit and been a little bit more active than what white did. So instead, white went for the move rook fb1, and the real issue I have with this move is that the b5 pawn wasn't really being attacked, right? Like, I couldn't take on b5 because, well, actually, I take that back. Maybe I could take on b5 because if a move like h3 is played, after takes, if he pins, the queen on e4 is actually hit. So, yeah, maybe actually b5 was attacked. So, okay, maybe I shouldn't fault rook fb1 so hard. But anyways, after rook fb1, I now went rook fc8, and I got a head start on my plan. And now I'm actually threatening knight c3, which is a very nice fork, which would force white to part with one of his bishops. So I thought that now I was kind of taking over the initiative a little bit. Additionally, now after rook fb1, the f2 pawn is just a little bit sensitive. So there are some ideas with bishop c5 and this battery on the diagonal here. So you could just see how black's play on the queen side is really giving him really ample play. So after rook fc8, queen e1 was played, and this is actually a very interesting move and not one I'd seriously considered, but it has some very interesting concepts. Firstly, you're actually protecting f2, which is nice. You're overprotecting f2. And secondly, in some lines, there's actually bishop a5 is an idea challenging this queen on b6. So very, very interesting. Lastly, it also covers the c3 square, right? So we said that knight c3 was a threat, so now that's not possible. So now I actually went for queen d8, trying to reroute this queen because I actually thought that my queen was no longer doing an amazing job on this diagonal, given that the battery was kind of, prevented. And I thought queen f8 might be another nice square from which I can attack a3. So I thought this was kind of clever. And then in some lines, I thought maybe it would be nice for my bishop to instead sit on b6 instead of my queen. So yeah, dual threat, two ideas. After queen d8, white went for knight d4, trying to reroute that knight. And maybe this, you can argue that's why queen b6 wasn't a great, or queen d8 wasn't a great move, because I actually allow the knight to get to d4. But the computer actually really liked queen d8, and yeah, I thought, attacking a3 would make sense. So after knight d4, I went for queen f8, challenging this pawn on a3, and I thought I was really getting somewhere now, because you could see this pawn is very sensitive. Bishop b4 is not a possibility because I'd snap it off with the knight and get the two bishops, and now, maybe I could consider doubling on the c-file. So after queen f8, knight c2 was played, and this is a very passive move, guarding a3 with retreating, and yeah, it seemed like black was taking over a little bit. I went rook c5 now, trying to double rooks, and because once I double the rooks, I thought knight c3 might be a legitimate threat again, eyeing that square, and also challenging the knight on c2. After rook c5, knight b4 is played. Makes a lot of sense, trying to kind of trade some pieces. And I went for rook a c8, doubling the rooks. And after knight a2, again, you can see that he's desperately trying to cover the c3 square, which I'm really hammering away at with my pieces. And you could just see all the coordination in my pieces is pointing towards important squares on the queen side. So this is what you call maximizing the activity of your pieces. But it was very important for me here to find some type of, active knockout blow. And unfortunately here, there isn't a total knockout blow. And it seems like I've done everything right in the last few moves to get everything consolidated. But it appears there's no move that kind of completely wins the game. But there are nice little ideas to keep the initiative going. The move I played, knight b6, tries to do that, but unfortunately isn't one of them. Instead, amazingly enough, this is not a move I was really considering, but f6 is a very, very nice move that actually loosens the screws. And I would never in a million years have wanted to play f6 willingly, because it would appear that after you take, you've weakened your whole kingside structure and your pawns. But the problem is actually you can't take, because after bishop takes f6, the rook on a1 is caught and trapped, so I pick up an exchange. And yeah, this is just an exchange. And so the point is, after f6, you can't take. And if you play a move like bishop e4, now I actually take on e5, because it's just an extra pawn. And so even though it's a double pawn, it is an extra pawn, and I might get play now on the f-file. And white is still kind of, tied up here. Although the bishop is doing a nice job kind of keeping the position, holding the position together, black is better. So f6 was a serious, serious alternative to what I did, and frankly, not a move I was looking at. Instead, I played knight b6, trying to eye the c4 square now, because I thought that from c4, my knight would target both the a3 pawn and the e5 pawn. So that was the concept there. Knight c3 was played now, and this is actually a move I missed, but was actually very, very alert by Andrew, noticing that now my knight was not guarding the c3 square. This knight could jump into e4. And this move really, really startled me, because I actually had not seriously considered it. And part of the reason may have been because I was in some time trouble. I was in a circumstance where I was trying to make good moves, but I also had to pick up the pace a little bit. And it was already so early in the game. I mean, the control we're playing with is 90 minutes plus 30-second increment for the whole game, but no second time control. So you really have to manage your time well, and I wanted to kind of keep the pace going so I didn't, get into more serious time trouble, because I think I had like 40 minutes left here. And you might say, well, 40 minutes is, plenty of time, but, we're on move 20-something, and, I mentioned this was the longest game of the year for me, so keep that in mind. So anyways, after knight c3, knight e4 is a huge threat, hitting my c5 rook, maybe jumping into f6 or d6, making me part with the e7 bishop. And those things I didn't really want, so I actually decided to jump in with knight c4, at least trying to get white's dark square bishop. But it actually turns out I didn't need to panic, and instead could have played queen g7, but this was a move I just missed. The idea is that knight e4 is actually not possible, because black can actually just take the pawn on e5, and there's no discovery checks that black can't easily parry, and it's just a pawn up. So this is a move that would have been pretty good. Note that bishop c3, which looks like it is a nice skewer of black's heavy pieces, loses on the spot to rook takes c4. And you can see that tactically, the queen on e1 is hit, and after queen takes e4, queen takes c3, black is just up and exchange. Or excuse me, up 2 pieces for the rook. So this would just be winning for black. So, yeah, did not see that one. Instead, after knight c4, bishop takes c4 is pretty much obliged. And after rook takes c4, white actually got in knight e4. And this kind of turned the tables a little bit, because all of a sudden it went from me playing this like really positional game to white having some nasty tactical threats and counterplay on the dark squares. So I definitely should not have allowed this maneuver. After knight takes e4, I was so panicked by this knight coming to f6 or d6 that I actually lashed out and played f5. But it actually turns out here that queen g7 is actually totally playable, just covering the f6 square this way. And if the knight jumps into d6, I actually can just take it and go queen d4 and try to pick up the d6 pawn. And it appears that black is actually okay here. But I was very uncomfortable with my dark squares pretty much being like Swiss cheese right now, just totally exposed. And I just wasn't really trying to go for this. So instead, I was like, you know what? I'm going to just play... if I'm going to have weak dark squares, I'm at least going to have activity for it. And that's why I played f5. But I fully expected that after en passant and bishop takes f6, my advantage has kind of evaporated from the standpoint that my king side is now, too weak to seriously consider having an advantage. And white now actually has some active play. Now I am hitting this rook on a1, and that's kind of what I was counting on. So I expected white to exchange on f6, which Andrew did. But an even better move would have actually been to start with bishop b4. And the point is, you hit my queen on f8, and after queen g7, you actually just go rook a2. And the concept is that this knight on e4 is, again, threatening now a fork on d6, and can kind of get rid of the bishop on... I'm drawing all these weird arrows. The knight can kind of get rid of the bishop on f6 whenever he wants. And the knight is actually doing, more critical jobs as well. And again, I have the 2 bishops, but this is tough to defend. Tough to defend with my weak dark squares. So kind of grateful that knight takes f6 was played. And after queen takes f6, I've kind of stabilized because I have enough activity to compensate my weak dark squares. Now, white went for rook b4, I think trying to kind of liquidate a little bit because white was also running a little bit short of time. And I took on b4, just trading. And after bishop takes b4, I went bishop takes b5. And I was like, okay, that was a little bit strange. He kind of lashed out to trade, a pair of rooks, but I actually won a pawn. So now I thought that, okay, it's opposite colored bishops, but as long as there are heavy pieces on the board, maybe I could entertain some chances. So yeah, I started to get a little bit optimistic. And the question in these opposite colored bishop, positions is always which bishop is going to be more of a menace to the opponent's king. So I think we're both trying to get our bishops on the diagonals pointing at the king, and it's a question of who can get that done faster. White now went rook d1, trying to get this rook active on the d file, and I went for bishop c6, trying to rush my bishop to the king side. And also, you note that my bishop on c6 is really well placed, protecting the b7 pawn and the a4 pawn, so my queen side is really well consolidated. Now, white went bishop c3, now trying to get his bishop to this diagonal. And I went for queen f5, a nice little creeper move that eyes the e5 square, so the queen can't just jump in there unscathed, and considers queen g4 as an idea, or trying to threaten mate, or queen e4 in some lines. So that was the concept there. After queen f5, rook d4 was played, and this is actually a mistake. A much better move would have been f3, and the reason for this is you give yourself, you correct the back rank weakness that you had, and you blunt the bishop's strength on this diagonal. And I think from a practical perspective, this position would be fairly difficult for black to play, because I can't really blunt the white squared bishop, or excuse me, white's dark squared bishop as well as he could blunt mine. So, I mean, I'd pretty much have to play e5 to do that, and yeah, it remains to be seen whether I want to play e5 or not, because then I weaken another diagonal. So, f3 really would have been the way to go. Instead, rook d4 tries to, I think, get another piece into the game or into the attack, but it's a little bit awkward because not only do you soften up your back rank a little bit, but you're also blocking the bishop on this diagonal, so I don't really have to worry tactically about queen e5 at the moment. So after rook d4, I actually went e5 because I thought I can get this move in with tempo and shut out the bishop. I thought, okay, this is pretty good because now it's not actually I'm not actually giving up a pawn anymore because it's not attacked twice. The rook now went to c4, and again, I thought this was very awkward here. The rook is not protected. It's kind of wayward here, and after the move rook d8, I actually indirectly protect e5 because of the back rank. So I thought that I was actually getting chances that were really unwarranted in this position. And I was already thinking about positions where the queens come off the board, because now that, I've secured my queen side, I could very seriously consider attacking the a3 pawn in the endgame and getting really concrete play. Now, white went for h3, giving himself a back rank escape square finally. And now I went rook d5, trying to just shore up the e5 square, the e5 pawn, stopping rook c5 from attacking my pawn horizontally, and just making it difficult on white to make moves. White now went queen e3, and this was actually a critical mistake that I was not able to take advantage of. The best move in the position would have been king h2, which is a little bit unusual, but I think the idea is just to step out of any checks or any tactics. Queen e3 actually is not a good move because, amazingly, I have the move rook d3. And the issue is you can't take on e5, because if you take there, I take on a3 and I have two connected passed pawns, which opposite-colored bishops are not, with heavy pieces on the board. This is just a winning position. And because of that, you actually have to retreat back to e2. But this actually allows a really amazing tactic, bishop takes g2. And the point is that after king takes g2, queen takes h3, I have a really amazing position where after king g1 and rook takes e3, I'm actually pretty close to winning, because these queen endgames are just lost, having 4 versus 1, and there isn't a perpetual check here to save the game. So it actually turns out tactically I have really good chances with this rook d3 move. And in fact, you would need to, kind of try to hold the game some other way, but it's very difficult. So after h3 and queen e3, I actually did go rook d3. But after queen e2, I actually went rook d5 back because I did not see the bishop takes g2 shot. So that's a little unfortunate. Now, queen e3 was played again, trying to repeat, and I had another opportunity to go for rook d3, but I did not find it. Instead went for queen d3, which I thought was a very safe move that gives me chances of, winning chances in an endgame a pawn up. and because the rook on c4 is also hanging. So after queen takes d3, rook takes d3, we have this endgame I'm talking about, but I did not win the pawn on a3, and it is a very, very tricky one. So this is, we're on move, what move are we on? We're on, I think, move 44, 45 or so, and this is now an endgame that's going to last nearly 100 moves, and I want to kind of explain the contours of this ending because I'm probably not going to go over every single move. And so the point in this endgame is that in a dream scenario is that I walk my king over through the center, f7, e6, d5, and somehow try to challenge the a3 pawn before white consolidates. Now, white is going to try to consolidate by getting the king in the game, playing f3 to blunt my bishop on this diagonal, and put the bishop on b4 and argue that I can't make use of my 2-on-1 as long as the bishop is on b4 and the pawn's on a3 protecting each other, because I would not have the bishop to challenge. Now, one of the nice tricks in positions like this is in some lines, if I walk my king close enough and the bishop is still on b4, there's some lines where I can actually play rook takes b4 if the rook was not on c4. And the point is that exchange sacrifice softens up white's queen side and gives my a pawn the ability to run. And again, if my king is close enough, if I get two connected passers with the bishop, that would actually be a winning position. So, in actual fact, it's funny because I had a very, very similar ending in what tournament was it? The Chicago Open a little while ago. And if you followed the Chicago Open games, I went over a game against FIDE Master, I want to say Alexander Chua, I want to believe, with the black pieces, and it was a very similar endgame to this with opposite colored bishops and a pair of rooks. And I actually won with that exchange sacrifice. So definitely check out that game if you haven't seen already, because the themes are very similar. So that's kind of the dream scenario. And I guess the truth of the matter is this position with best play is a draw. But if you're playing it for a really long time, it's very difficult for your opponent to defend well for a sustained period of time if you put on the pressure for a long time. So that's what I tried to do. So let's see how I did that. So bishop e4, again covering the a3 pawn like we talked about. King f7, rook c3, trying to trade these rooks, because if the rooks come off the board like this is a dead draw. Again, if rook takes, bishop takes, king e6, bishop e4, the bishop can just shuffle on this diagonal, and there's just no way I can break this position with the bishop on this diagonal. So this would just be a dead draw. So because of that, I do not want to trade rooks. So I went for rook d1 check, and after king h2, rook b1, and you could see I'm already entertaining trying to take on b4. f3 is played, blunting the bishop like we talked about. King e6, bishop c5. And I think this is actually a really alert move, because I think Andrew's already noticing that my king is very, very close, and I will sacrifice on b4 if I get close enough. So very, very alert not to keep the bishop on that square. I went king d5 now, hoping the bishop would go back to b4, and rook c2 was played. And again, very, very alert, because if you play bishop b4 here, I'll snack on b4 right away. And this position is very, very dangerous for black. I think it's probably lost, because after rook c1 now, I can go bishop d5. And this is the point, is now I'm actually threatening a3 and a2, which would tie the rook down. So yeah, very, very tricky position. Let's say, like, just to give you an example, like king g3, a3, king f2. I'll go king d3 to blocks out this king and f2. Let's say king e1. Maybe bishop b3, again, to cut this king off from d1. And if king f2, a2, or actually, let me start with king a2 here. King e1, bishop c2, and, this is be the nail in the coffin, bishop b1. Like if king f2, bishop b1, and if rook a1, bishop b1 anyway, and you can see now the rook is just trapped, and I can just collect it with king c3 and king b2. So that's kind of the idea in these certain positions where you can sack the exchange to facilitate your a pawn running up the board. So rook c2 is very alert. And now I went rook b3, trying to hopefully get that bishop to come back to b4, but Andrew was not biting on that one. So new plan, king g1, bishop b5, bishop f8, bishop c4, and we're just moving. I'm improving b5, getting my pawns closer up the board. Everything's protected. And now he's providing some checks, and bishop c5, just trying to blockade on this diagonal. So I have to try and improve somehow. So I try to first cut off this rook on the d file with bishop c4 and bishop d3. And then my idea is to try and walk in the king like so. But after bishop f8, now you can see the king is coming to e3. So I decide to play e4 now to kind of break open the position before the king can get comfortable on e3. After takes, I now went king e5, and that was my idea, was to try and get the king to e4 to kind of box out the white king, because if the bishop just shuffles here, this is actually kind of difficult if the king is not active, and because now my rook is free to roam and maybe provide some harassment somewhere else. So after king e5, king e3 is actually played, which I think is a good move, because it forces me to take the pawn with the bishop. And even though this is discovery check, the king still, is not as active on e4 as it would like to be. I now went bishop d3 back, king e3, bishop c4 check, king f2, and h5, and trying to now push some pawns on the king side to take space on that side. But maybe g5 would have been a little bit better just to fix these pawns on light squares, because after the move h4 was played here, after h5, h4, you can see it's actually kind of difficult to break this dark square construction, and now the bishop can sometimes sit on this diagonal. So maybe g5 is a little bit better, but I thought now h4 might be a target. So I went bishop d3 to cut this rook off again. And after king e3, bishop e4, king f2, I went king f5. And my idea was to move my king in towards the h-pawn. And note how I very skillfully with my bishop made sure the rook has not harassed me with checks. So that was the point of actually having the bishop on d3 a little while ago, to cut off the rook best I can. And now I do the shuffle again so that it can't harass me on d5. So you have to be very, very careful just to not make sure he's just checking you to death, and I've managed to do that pretty well. All right, so rook e2, bishop d3, rook e3, rook b2 check, and I'm finally getting somewhere because now I've combined threats connected to playing b4 with threats against white's king side pawns, and that's huge. I mean, kind of the principle of two weaknesses is coming in big time right now. And now my idea was now to play bishop e4 and challenge the g2 pawn. So after rook b2, king f3 is the only move to stop bishop e4. Now I went bishop c4 with the same idea to play bishop d5 check. And I've really gotten somewhere. Rook e5 check was now played, and it's a really, really cunning move. And very, very clever, because the point is now if I go king takes e5, there's bishop g7 check, picking off the rook on g7, and you can see after king f5 takes, we get to this dead drawn position I discussed where the bishop just comes back to b4 and holds the game. So very, very clever and alert by Andrew Hong, and it's just actually a good example of the stronger you get, the more tenacious people are in defense. So you can see how he's just really, really fighting and tooth and nail to hold on here. So after rook e5, I went king f6, not taking the rook. Funny move to make, but I just can't take it. And after rook g5, he's managed to protect the pawn on g2 this way, which is very, very creative. So now I went bishop e2 check, challenging this way since bishop d5 is no longer an option. And after king g3, I went bishop d3, trying to get in bishop e4. And king f4 was played. Now I went bishop f5. And you could see here how I'm trying to lock in this rook and box it out so that my king can become active again. I think I played this pretty well to get this type of chance. Rook g3 was played, trying to crawl out. And now I went rook c2. But it actually turns out I had a much, much stronger move in the form of rook f2 check. The idea is that after king e3, I have rook c4, or rook c2, and after rook c4 is coming, I can actually challenge the h4 pawn. And this is a move, frankly, this maneuver I missed. White could play bishop b4, but this is actually an only move to hold the game. And the concept is that after rook c4, White actually has the amazingly miraculous move bishop e1 to protect the h4 pawn. And I highly, highly doubt that Andrew would have found this. The point is that if I take the pawn now in h4, there's rook takes g6 check. And you could see that after I recapture the rook, bishop takes h4, we have another dead drawn position with the bishop now coming back to e7 to blockade. And what a hero that bishop would be, defending and attacking when necessary. But I highly doubt this bishop b4, bishop e1 maneuver would have been found in time trouble. Anyways, I did go for rook c2 right away. And because of this, it actually allows rook e3, which gives White the opportunity to come back to g3 and protect the pawn that way. But the issue is that he actually doesn't protect the pawn, because now I have rook takes g2. And so the point is actually I'm recovering the pawn, but White now still has a really good blockade on the dark squares, even though I'm actually 2 pawns up, because he's holding firm control of both the g5 square and the b4 square right now. So even here, more work is to be done, and I'm not winning, which is really amazing. But I tried to press on. Bishop e7 check, king f7, bishop g5. You can see he's firmly blockading on these dark squares. And I must say, there were certain positions where I was wondering if I can now exchange sacrifice on g5. But that's kind of out of the question if the king is close to the side where I'm trying to push the pawn. So I got to try and push a little bit more. So I went rook g4 check, king e5, and b4, trying to get a pass pawn now while the bishop was not on the diagonal anymore. And after a takes b4, rook takes b4, I'm almost there. I'm very, very close. I'm pushing, trying to make things happen. King d6, rook b6, king c5, rook b7, guarding against rook e7 check, which would be a very, very annoying move to harass my king. King c6, rook a7, king b6, trying to harass my rook before I get this a pawn going. Because if I push this a pawn now, I'm just completely winning. Because the bishop is now not on the diagonal right now, because my king is holding that f6 square. So now I went rook a8, king b7, rook a5, king b6, rook d5, cutting off the king on the 5th rank. I thought was critical, because now the king is behind the pawn, and I might have some chances here. And now rook e7 check, king f8, rook a7, getting behind the pawn is always a good idea when you're defending. You want to get behind the pawn instead of in front of it, because then you're kind of at the mercy of the pawn being pushed. And here you're eyeing the pawn and can also be active and check the king. So good move there. And now bishop d7 was played, and my idea here was now to get my king back in the game while also cutting off the rook from the 7th rank. And I protect the a4 pawn. And this construction here with the bishop on d7 and rook on d5 is actually a winning construction, because the point is as long as this is established, the white king actually can't, get out of the box and kind of challenge the a pawn. So this is actually a winning construction, and I'm actually very, very close to finishing the game here. But White was still tenacious. King c7, and here on move 87, I miss what is the winning one of the winning maneuvers here, which would have been the move king f7. And the idea is that after rook a6, again, you don't want to allow my king out of the box, because then I can support the a pawn. I actually have the move bishop b5, and after rook a8, king e6, I finally get out of the box and can even entertain trading rooks now, because if rook takes d5, the issue is now the king is not close enough to, it's behind the pawn, so it can't catch it, and so the bishop has to support it. And after king a5, a3, king b4, a2, and bishop f6, now g5 would win. An amazing breakthrough. Point being that after h takes g5, h4, and you could see here the bishop on f6 can't stop both pawns and get on the diagonal in time. Also, note that a move like note that a move after g5, a move like king b3 also would fail, because after g4, king takes a2, g3, this bishop will get on the diagonal, but this pawn is actually the right color square for my bishop. So the point is that after g2, after bishop e1, g2, bishop b6, I actually can get my king over to the king side just in time to actually win this game, and well, basically queen my last remaining pawn, because I actually have the right color, the right color bishop. So just to illustrate, you can't actually stay in the corner here, and that means that I'll push my pawn up the board comfortably and win. So that would have been a key maneuver. Playing king f7 and getting my king out of the box would have been the way to play. Tough to see that, but it is what it is. So instead, sorry, I'm trying to get back to the position. Instead, I played bishop e8, and I thought this was nice because now I'm shielding my king from checks, but it's actually just too slow. King b6 now, rook b5, king c7, rook d5, and I do manage to get back to this position and start to get my king in, and I do sort of course correct, and after king g7, rook f3, I have another winning opportunity here, and I miss it. I was, kind of hell-bent on keeping the rooks on the board because I was always seeing these endgames where I had to do that. But here, actually, rook d3 actually wins. And again, the point is that trading rooks gives me an endgame that's winning, because this bishop can't control the a pawn and stop the g5 breakthrough. And because you can't trade rooks, well, you eventually have to, because I'm actually going to play a3 and a2, just queening the pawn. And so it's just a tough endgame. But just to illustrate again, we have another scenario where I'm queening. And one of the things here I found was super fascinating was now in this version, the king actually does get closer to the pawn on a2, but it doesn't get to b2, which is really critical. And the point here is that there's this amazing maneuver. If I play g5 right away, it draws, because after g5, h takes g5, I play h4. The king is actually in time to get back into the square and challenge. But the point is actually this amazing maneuver. Instead of playing g5 right away, you play bishop d7. And the point is that after bishop g7 and bishop c6, now you prepare the g5 break. Note that the king can't come closer, because now I have king c2 and king b1, and I can queen. And so the king is frozen on d2. But if you play bishop f6 now I go bishop d5, and after bishop g7, g5. And this is a beautiful breakthrough, because the bishop on d5 is perfectly placed to guard the g8 square, which is where white's pawn will want to go, and eyeing the h1 square and stopping the king from coming over easily. So the point is, after g5, h takes g5, h4, now the king starts to come closer, but after h2, it's actually cut off. All of the entry squares are covered by black pieces, and it's actually winning by a thread. So really, really critical breakthrough that's important to understand is this g5 sacrifice to essentially get open another passed pawn. And basically, white can't hold it all together. But unfortunately, I missed this concept. Again, you can see the trading rooks at a right moment when the king is behind the a pawn was the winning strategy. Instead, I went bishop c4, trying to keep material on the board and trying to push my a pawn like so. And even here, I actually have another winning chance after king b6. And this was probably the last really big chance. It was the move rook. Instead of rook a8, which I played, the move was actually just rook a6 check. And the idea is that after king c5, I actually can just go a3 and push this pawn. And the issue is you can't take because a2, and note that my rook is guarding this diagonal that the bishop would love to jump to. So after rook e7, king f8, the bishop still can't get onto this diagonal, and so white would have to give up the rook for the a pawn, and two pawns and a rook versus bishop and pawn would be winning on the king side. So rook a6 check and a2 would have been totally winning, but I just missed that I didn't have to move my bishop here. And you can definitely say fatigue is kicking in, because this was move 96. So I went rook a8, rook a3, and bishop b3, and I thought this was clever because now the rook is trapped again behind my bishop, but it's not winning because the king, or it's not easily winning because the king can come back and support the rook. And so I freed my king, got active, but white maintained this blockade on the a file. And unfortunately, I hadn't moved a pawn here for nearly 50 moves, and the 50 move rule crops in. If you haven't moved any pawn for 50 moves, and no pieces have been exchanged, the position can be claimed a draw, and so by your opponent if they're counting. And I'd noticed Andrew counting for a long time, and so I was doing some counting too, and I realized I did not have many moves left to pressure white. So I tried to get in some counterplay here, trying to press a little bit more. And maybe this was my last chance. I went king b4, allowing bishop c5 check. I should have gone king b5, because now if bishop c5, I actually have rook c7, which pins and maybe makes it a little bit difficult on him to establish the blockade, because maybe I could trade rooks again, but and get to that winning endgame we talked about. But instead I went king b4, and after bishop c5 check, the bishop actually got to a3 with tempo, which makes sure he's still blockading this pawn. And yeah, I wasn't able to make much more progress. I tried to keep pressure going, and one thing here is the rook exchange here is actually not a win. And the reason it's not a win here is because the king is actually in the box. So just to illustrate it, after rook takes c2, king takes c2, if I try the same breakthrough at g5, this is actually completely drawn, because even with the g-pawn off the board, let's say white's g-pawn is gone, white can actually sacrifice his bishop for the h3 pawn and actually just keep this king in the corner on a1, because it's the wrong color square for my bishop. So essentially, we can have a scenario where, I win the bishop, and it's still a draw. So, let's just illustrate, just to shuffle. Oops, that allows queen, so let's not do that. Let's say I go king d7. Just shuffling. I think you can get the point now, but, oh, nope, we don't want to give it up for free. That would be bad. Let's say here. And you could see now there's no way I can make progress, because the king could just shuffle between a1 and b2 and draw the game. So that is an amazing, amazing line, but just illustrates that, there are some ways that white can hold the draw with the opposite colored bishops, but it's really because the king gets to the right corner and is able to stay there. So instead I did not trade rooks and kept the rooks on the board, but again, this dark square bishop is just a monster defending everything that it needs to defend. And because the king is in the corner, this is actually probably a draw. And I wound up having to give up the a4 pawn because it was actually the 50 move rule was coming. And, in a position where I have to give up the a pawn, now it's actually a dead draw, because now white has a firm blockade here, and there's no way that, I can really get anything going, especially with the king coming back to the king side and getting involved in the game. So I played a few more moves, but after rook e4, I actually just offered a draw, because I'm allowing rook e8 check, which would liquidate the bishops and make this game over. Very, very long and very exhausting game. Kudos if you got to the end of this game. I know this must have been a really long video. But it was worth it to fight out this ending. You could see that I had chances throughout the game, and unfortunately I just wasn't able to put my opponent away. But I thought I really handled the middle game well, especially considering I hadn't played the specific line in the opening before. And yeah, it's always interesting when you play something new and it goes well. So It was a good feeling. Now, unfortunately, I was not able to put him away, and that was actually kind of a big deal because I was really tired and weary after this game, and there were 2 rounds a day in this tournament, and, basically having a 6-hour game meant that you only have like 30 minutes before the next one. So I really now was just trying to get food and scrambling to get some energy before the next one because I was exhausted. I pretty much played 3 games in 1 game. This was 138 moves. So anyways, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.